Welcome back to Historical Documentary Official. In today's documentary, we uncover a story that shaped the world.
It begins in the dark, before England was even England, before a language called English existed, before stories were written in neat script or recorded on preserved parchment. It begins in a world where myths moved only by voice, and memories were the only libraries anyone possessed. And yet, from this silence, this fragile, uncertain world, would rise one of the richest literary traditions in human history. Imagine a cold dawn over the island that would one day be called Britain. Mists slide over the hills, villages are quiet, fires are low, and the only sounds come from the sea and the wind. There is no written English yet. No Chaucer. No Shakespeare. No Austen or Dickens. Just scattered tribes, each keeping their stories alive by repeating them night after night, around small flames that push back endless darkness. This is where our story begins. The narrator's voice softens, almost whispering, to draw the viewer deeper. English literature did not begin with books. It began with memory, fragile stories passed from one generation to the next. Warriors spoke of battles to stir courage. Elders shared tales of spirits, storms, and strange creatures to keep families together. And slowly, a tradition formed, taking root in the minds of the people long before ink touched parchment. Into this world came the earliest architects of English story, the Anglo-Saxons. They did not walk into history quietly, they arrived like a tide, carrying with them their own sagas, their own rhythms, their own way of seeing the world. And with them came a story that would echo across 1,000 years, a tale of courage, monsters, and fate, a tale known today as Beowulf. The film lingers on an ancient hall glowing with firelight. A storyteller stands, lifting his voice as people gather. The atmosphere thickens with anticipation. The camera slowly draws the viewer closer, as if inviting them into the feast hall itself. And the narrator continues, Beowulf is not just a poem, it is a doorway. A glimpse into a world where heroes faced the night with nothing but strength and loyalty. Where monsters symbolized the fears haunting a fragile society. Where fate hung over every life like a shadow no one could escape. The poem speaks in rhythms of battle and bravery, yet beneath its armor lies something deeper, the human urge to be remembered, and in that urge, English literature found its beginning, but the world was changing. Christianity swept across the island, quietly at first, then swiftly. With it came monks, cloistered scholars, and scriptoria filled with scratching pens, dripping candles, and parchments smoothed by careful hands. For the first time, English words were written down. The chaotic world of oral tradition began to find order, shape, and permanence. The documentary shifts to a dimly lit monastery room. A young monk bends over a manuscript, his hands steady, his eyes trained by years of silent discipline. Around him lie ink pots, sharpened quills, scraped hides ready to become pages. This is where English literature gained its foundation. Quietly. Patiently. Quill after quill, line after line, a language found its voice. The narrator lets the moment breathe. English literature grew not from kings or battles alone, but from quiet scribes who spent their entire lives preserving stories they would never claim as their own. They saved poems, translated homilies, shaped religious texts, and in doing so, carved out the earliest written records of the English tongue. Centuries pass in a cinematic transition. Empires rise and fall. New rulers come with new languages. And then, suddenly, history shatters. In 1066, the Norman conquest explodes into England like a storm. Swords clash. Castles burn. The old world folds under the weight of a new one. And with it comes the French language, smooth, elegant, aristocratic, pushing itself into courts, law, culture, and society. English does not disappear, but it sinks underground, spoken by common people, surviving in fields, kitchen hearths, and simple households. The narrator pauses. This moment is critical. Out of conflict, a transformation begins. English starts absorbing French words, thousands of them. Words of law, government, emotion, romance, architecture, food, fashion. Slowly the language becomes richer, more flexible, more nuanced. And with this transformation, literature must transform too. Then, after nearly 3 centuries of silence in the written world, a figure emerges, one whose shadow will stretch across all future English writing. The viewer sees a medieval street, bustling with life, as the narrator continues, Geoffrey Chaucer, not a priest. Not a king. Not a noble by birth. A man who traveled, observed, listened. A man alive with curiosity. A man who knew people, their flaws, their dreams, their laughter. And through them, he gave English literature something extraordinary, personality. The camera pans over a writing desk where a quill moves quickly. The Canterbury tales take shape, full of humor, satire, wisdom, and human character. The narrator guides the viewer deeper into the story. For the first time, English literature does not merely record life, it mirrors it. Chaucer gives us merchants, knights, millers, cooks, clerks, wives, real people with real voices. The English language breathes differently after Chaucer. And so does its literature. As the medieval world stretches toward its end, new winds begin to blow. A time of rebirth is rising on the horizon, a renaissance. A rebirth of ideas, knowledge, creativity. The world is changing, and at the center of this rising transformation is a man whose imagination will redefine what English and the English language begins to stretch, crackle, and glow with new electricity. The Renaissance sweeps across England like a warm wind after a long winter. Ideas flow in from Italy, France, ancient Greece, and the newly rediscovered texts of Rome. Scholars argue, poets experiment, and audiences crave stories that reflect the complexity of human emotion. In this unfolding storm of creativity stands a figure whose name will outlive kings, nations, and centuries, William Shakespeare. The film zooms into the dirt pathways of Elizabethan London. Vendors shout. Horses pull carts through narrow streets. The Thames glitters under a soft morning haze. And there, in the middle of this vibrant chaos, stands the Globe Theatre, a wooden circle alive with murmuring voices. The narrator speaks softly, as if unveiling a sacred relic. Shakespeare's plays are not simply stories. They are mirrors, clear and unblinking, reflecting the deepest desires, fears, and contradictions of human beings. Love and jealousy, ambition and betrayal, madness and hope. He gives English literature a gift it has never seen before, a complete map of the human heart. Inside the globe, actors rush to prepare. Costumes rustle, scripts are memorized, voices warm up. When the play begins, the audience is drawn instantly into worlds beyond their own. A doomed prince in Denmark. Star-crossed lovers in Verona. A haunted king chasing power into madness. A jealous soldier torn apart by poisoned words. Shakespeare's characters breathe with such human truth that centuries later, their emotions still feel familiar. The narrator slows down, giving the viewer room to absorb the weight of this moment. Shakespeare does not just shape literature, he expands the English language itself. More than 1,000 words appear for the first time in his works. Countless phrases that people speak naturally today were born from his imagination. The language becomes richer, more flexible, more capable of capturing the full range of human experience, but the story of English literature is not the story of one man alone. As Shakespeare's star rises, so do the voices around him. Writers like Christopher Marlowe and Ben Jonson challenge, provoke, and inspire him. Their works push English drama into bold new territories full of intensity and daring. Audiences grow hungry for theatrical magic, and literature responds with passion, yet time moves forward. The Renaissance softens into the trembling uncertainties of the 1600s. England fractures under political tension. War stirs. And amid this turmoil, literature takes on new forms. The camera shifts to a dimly lit study where a man writes by candlelight, his face shadowed by worry and ambition. This is John Milton. Blind, exiled, caught between worlds, and yet determined to shape English literature in a way that echoes scripture, rebellion, and humanity. Paradise Lost emerges as a towering epic, a poetic universe of heaven, hell, angels, temptation, and the fragile will of humans caught in between. It is a poem of cosmic scale, written with the weight of fallen kingdoms pressing on every line. Milton gives English literature a kind of grandeur it has never known before, a voice that resonates with thunder. As decades pass, England's wounds continue to heal and reopen. Society changes once again. The age of drama and epic poetry transforms into an age of wit, clarity, and reason. Coffeehouses replace feasting halls. The sound of scribbling pens becomes constant. Writers debate politics, philosophy, morality, satire. And through this shift emerges a new voice, sharp, observant, and brilliantly playful. The narrator leans into this moment as the camera enters a lively 18th-century coffeehouse filled with conversation, pamphlets, and ink-stained hands. This is the era of Jonathan Swift, whose imagination gives birth to journeys both fantastical and brutally honest. In Gulliver's Travels, giants and tiny people become symbols for society's excesses and failures. Swift hides truth behind illusion, humor behind criticism, creating literature that entertains while slicing through the flaws of human behavior. And then another voice rises, Alexander Pope, with lines as precise as a blade. His poetry captures elegance, order, and balance, shaping the very idea of good taste in English literature. The documentary narrator slows, highlighting how English writing evolves with every century. As people change, stories change with them. New forms emerge. Expectations shift. Literature reflects life, always adapting, but a revolution is coming, one that will transform English literature in ways no one could predict. Cities grow, factories rise, machines roar, and society accelerates at a speed never seen before. The Industrial Revolution demands new voices, new themes, and new emotional depths. It is here, in the 18th century turning toward the 19th, that a group of visionaries ignite a movement that shakes the entire literary world. The narrator's voice becomes warm, almost reverent. The Romantic Poets. Writers who step away from logic and turn toward nature, imagination, emotion, and the vast landscapes of the human soul. William Wordsworth wandering through fields, searching for meaning in nature's quiet moments. Samuel Taylor Coleridge dreaming of ancient mariners and haunted voyages. Percy Bysshe Shelley writing with flames of rebellion. Lord Byron living boldly, dangerously, leaving behind verses filled with beauty and despair, and above them, a gentle spirit burns with fierce talent, John Keats. A young man who writes with urgency, knowing time will betray him. His poems shimmer with longing, beauty, fragility. He gives English literature something pure, something eternal, something untouched by cynicism. Romanticism shapes the emotional core of modern English writing. But even as poets explore the depths of imagination, the world continues to grow harsher, faster, and more complex. A new era approaches. Victorian England rises, a century of reform, invention, and contradiction. Poverty and industry. Progress and suffering. Morality and hypocrisy. And at the center of this sprawling world stands a titan of storytelling, Charles Dickens. The narrator guides the viewer into smoky streets filled with chimney sweeps, street children, and carriages clattering over stone. Dickens captures every corner of society, giving voice to the poor, the forgotten, the ignored. His novels are not merely stories, they are worlds, full of laughter, sorrow, cruelty, kindness, injustice, and redemption. He becomes the heartbeat of Victorian literature, but he is not alone. The Brontë sisters write with passion and Gothic intensity. Jane Austen transforms the novel into a study of character, emotion, and social nuance. Thomas Hardy paints tragic landscapes where fate presses hard on every life. English literature grows more intimate, more psychological, more daring. The documentary flows seamlessly through these shifting worlds. English literature is no longer a single story but a multitude, woven together by centuries of voices responding to change. The story of English literature moves into its next great transformation as the world itself begins to change. The Industrial Revolution reshapes cities and human lives. Steam, smoke, and steel rise into the sky. In this transformed world, literature becomes both a mirror and a protest. The familiar narrators from earlier eras continue walking through the timeline, now stepping into the noise of modern streets. They observe the shift as voices multiply, styles evolve, and the purpose of storytelling itself begins to change. There is a moment when the narrator pauses inside a dim Victorian study where Charles Dickens writes late into the night. His ink-stained fingers move quickly across the page, driven by the suffering he has witnessed outside. Children sleeping in factories, hunger in the alleyways, endless work without rest. Dickens writes not only to entertain but to expose. His characters feel real because they come from real lives he carries in his memory. Shadows dance on the wall behind him as he finishes a chapter, unaware that his words will one day shape the conscience of a nation. Across the room, another figure sits quietly, observing. This is the poet who has followed our journey from medieval times. She watches how Dickens transforms struggle into story. She notices how his novels no longer resemble the dramas of Shakespeare or the epics of Milton. Something new is happening. Stories are becoming engines of empathy. Narratives are turning into instruments of reform. She writes this realization into her journal before continuing the long walk through time. Outside, the world grows restless. New voices arise. Thomas Hardy wanders through the English countryside, describing a world where fate presses down heavily on every soul. He speaks softly about rural life slipping into decline, about traditions being erased by the march of modernity. There is sorrow in his tone, but also defiance. His characters stand against the mercilessness of fate even when they cannot change it. Not far away, the Brontë sisters stand on the wild Yorkshire moors, the wind pulling at their dresses. The narrator sees them as three flames in a storm. Charlotte writes with fierce emotion, Emily with raw passion, and with moral clarity. Their novels echo with storms, secrets, locked doors, and women who refuse to be silent. Their world is small, but their imaginations are vast enough to outlive them by centuries. Time moves again. The 20th century begins in chaos. A new kind of darkness appears. World wars tear through continents and minds. Literature reacts with fear, confusion, and experimentation. Modernism rises not as a choice, but as a necessity. The narrator enters a small room in London where Virginia Woolf sits by a window, listening not to the street but to the movements of consciousness. She writes in flowing streams, dissolving the borders of time, showing inner worlds that had never before been captured on the page. Her characters think, feel, hesitate, and question. The world becomes psychological, layered, uncertain. At the same time, James Joyce leans over a cluttered table in Dublin, reshaping the boundaries of language itself. Our familiar narrator struggles to follow the labyrinth of his words. Sentences twist and bend, memories mix with dreams. But beneath the complexity lies a simple truth. Literature is becoming more daring, more free, more willing to break its own rules. The narrator writes this insight gently in the margins of her notebook before moving onward. The wars end, but the world does not quiet down. New nations rise, old empires fade, and English literature expands far beyond England. Voices from the Caribbean, Africa, South Asia, and beyond begin to reshape the language. Chinua Achebe writes about the collision of cultures. Derek Walcott speaks with the rhythm of the sea. Salman Rushdie blends myth with reality until they become inseparable. The narrator realizes that English literature is no longer one river but many streams flowing into a shared ocean. In classrooms, libraries, and theaters, new generations of writers challenge what literature can be. Science fiction grows from speculative imagination into philosophical commentary. George Orwell warns of the dangers of surveillance and lost freedom. Aldous Huxley imagines a future where comfort becomes a prison. Their stories linger in the world like prophecies waiting to be fulfilled. In a small room filled with typewriters, the narrator meets the poets of the post-war era. Sylvia Plath writes with painful honesty, turning emotion into sharp, crystalline verse. Ted Hughes captures the wildness of nature with fierce, muscular lines. Seamus Heaney digs through the soil of Ireland, unearthing ancient memories and buried histories. Their words feel intimate, yet universal. Time advances once more. Digital screens glow. The internet becomes a new landscape for storytelling. Voices rise from every direction. Literature becomes global, instantaneous, constantly evolving. The narrator stands in the middle of this new world, overwhelmed by its energy. Stories spread faster than ever. Genres blend. Boundaries blur. Yet the core remains unchanged. Humans still tell stories to survive, to understand, to remember. At the end of this long journey, the narrator opens her journal for the final time. She writes that English literature began with anonymous voices singing in firelit halls and now thrives in a world connected by unseen networks. It has survived wars, plagues, revolutions, censorship, and changing tastes. It has shifted from poetry to drama to novels to digital forms, each transformation driven by the people who lived through their ages. She looks back at the characters who walked beside her. The monk who preserved ancient poems. The medieval storyteller. The Renaissance playwright. The Romantic poet. The Victorian reformer. The Modernist visionary. The contemporary challenger. Though centuries apart, they share a single purpose. Each one, in their own way, sought to capture what it means to be human. The narrator closes the journal as the screen fades to darkness. A soft voice speaks once more, offering a final moment of reflection. English literature is not simply a record of written works. It is a living history of imagination. A map of human experience. A mirror of our fears, joys, dreams, and contradictions. And as long as people continue to read, write, and wonder, its story will never truly end. The documentary concludes with a gentle pause as the narrator whispers one final truth. The journey of English literature is not finished. It continues every time someone opens a book, every time a new writer takes a breath, every time a story begins.